Let's talk about UFC and martial arts in prison. My name is Jesse, and I spent 19 years in the Virginia prison system, and I've always loved martial arts. As a kid, it was the movies, it was doing karate, it was wrestling in high school, like that was all important to me, but you didn't have MMA gyms on every corner back then. In fact, you didn't have a single MMA gym in my whole town. So it wasn't something I could be exposed to. It wasn't like it is now where UFC is everywhere, like it was still on pay-per-view back then. So I got into the jail, and I was always interested, and I remember we used to have boxing on TV, and there was a guy in there who used to always train in the corner, but he wouldn't work with anybody else. But I was like, all right, he looks good, like he looks like he'd slip a punch, like he knows what he's doing, like maybe one day I'll learn to box, but I didn't know what that would look like. A few years later, I'd made it to my first major prison, and I ran into a guy named Big Baby. Big Baby was huge. He was called Big Baby for a reason. He was like 6'6", probably like 270. He ended up cutting down because he planned on boxing when he got out. Because at that time, he was a heavyweight boxing champion for the Nottoway Smokers. So I made him a deal because he'd been struggling to get his GED, and I was like, look, I'll make sure you get your GED, you teach me how to box. Cool. And by the way, normally you don't want to learn to box from a heavyweight because they're going to box with power and it's just not the same thing. This guy fought like a middleweight. As big as he was on his toes, he was moving, he was slipping, and he taught me a lot, and he got his GED, so it worked out for both of us. That was my first chance to really add something to my game because what I had from my childhood was really unrealistic. Like even full contact sparring and karate is not the same thing. Now the wrestling was good, but at the same time when you're not looking for that knee or that hand coming down, it's again not the same thing. But I learned a little bit and I was like, okay, cool, because at the same time, one of the local Fox affiliates was showing local fights in the middle of the night. We would stay up to like midnight on a Friday night, and they would show like some high school gym or some rec center, wherever it was, and these amateur MMA fights where they had weird rules about like where you could elbow, where you couldn't elbow, but it was MMA. And after not really seeing that, after not being exposed, it was cool to see what people were doing, try to understand the positions, try to understand how it worked. But so I moved on from there, got shipped to another prison, and started being able to learn because I ran into a guy who did this style, or did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or did Muay Thai, and we would go in the cell and we would train, and we would work on that. And at the same time, CBS started showing Elite XC, or I think that's what it was. It was one of the kind of like lower level operations, but it was like MMA. It was back when Kimbo Slice was in there and he got his head taken off or like his ear exploded. Like it was a rough kind of situation, but it was an exposure to it because I hadn't really seen that before. So I was like, bet, cool. Anyways, I think it was the Diaz brothers. Somebody like got into a fight after the fight and that's it. CBS was like, we're done. We're not doing this anymore. And I was disappointed because I wanted to be able to see this stuff. And at that point, I think UFC had gone on to Spike, and we didn't have Spike because we had a really limited cable package. But what I did have was more and more people who were doing martial arts. Because at that point, everybody's like, oh, you do martial arts? Like, go talk to Jesse. Like, go talk to Jesse. So people would come to me, and we would either be in the pod together and train, or we'd go try to train on the yard. And it ended up being this whole circle of guys who all had a common interest. Like, we wanted to become better fighters. We wanted to learn more about what we could do. Then a few years later, Fox got the UFC contract. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but it was a big deal because it was Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos. They only had one fight on the whole card. It was going to be the heavyweight championship. It was going to be a big fight. They had like an hour and a half of build-up, and then it was like one punch, and it was over. Like he literally hit him with an overhand, and he went down, and we were like, man, I've been hyped for this for a week, and I've been sitting in front of the TV, like pumped up for an hour and a half, and he really got knocked out with one punch. Like, you're serious? So they reworked it, and they started actually showing the fights regularly, which was really cool to me. Again, I had something to look forward to. I was so excited to know on Saturday night they're going to do that, or even the week before they would do like the Road to the Octagon, which is a story of the person and their training and where they came from, and I enjoyed that because it's about the style and it's about the skill, but it's also about the drama and the story, right? Like, the reason I'm so invested in the fighters is because I care about their story. Like they've gone through something, they've thrown themselves into something in a way that I admire or that I relate to or I think is beautiful. So sometimes I still have issues with UFC, sometimes I still think there's need to be stoppages, there are all kinds of issues, but there's something about it I've always found really beautiful. Because somebody said something about, whether people are dangerous or not. And the idea is, everything I always learned, especially in karate growing up, was to try to be as dangerous as possible, like to try to gain the ability to hurt other people, but at the same time, lose the inclination to do so. Because I saw a lot of people who didn't know how to fight, who were kind of like big, tough guys, and they would always get in fights, and they would either get beat up really bad, or they would hurt the other person really bad, because they had no control. But what I saw in UFC was people like honed like a weapon, but with a limitation. Now every now and then you had really bad examples like Crucibles, Palhares, who used to like try to break people's knees. But for the most part, these are like some of the most trained, skilled people in the world, and they know how to stop when they get a tap, or they know how to stop when the ref calls them off, and they can shake and they can give each other a hug afterwards. There's something I really admired about that because that person in a dangerous situation is able to respond with a vicious response, but is also able to stop themselves. So there's this balance of like control and dangerousness. I've just always thought that that was so important. Bruce Lee talks about that. I managed to read a lot of this like philosophy and poetry stuff while I was in, and he said that. He said like, look, violence is a part of the world. Like, you can deny it or you can ignore it or you can have a stance on it, but it is what it is. Like, how are you going to cope with that? Like, what is your role to accept or to combat or to deal with violence? And I always thought that was important because people didn't really talk about it. But so UFC became my thing. Like, everybody knew if it came on and I was asleep, like, come wake me up. If it came on and I was at work, try to get somebody to call the boss to let me know. Like, it was always cool. And the little fight club we had, which wasn't really about fighting, it was about training. It was about building a community of guys who wanted to train to be better fighters, but really to be better people. We took old gangbangers, we took guys that had a bunch of stabbing charges, we took all these guys who were always getting into trouble, and we said, look, you gotta leave that stuff at the door, and we managed to help each other become better people. And all of a sudden, when they noticed that all of our fighters, all the guys that used to be getting in trouble all the time, haven't gotten a charge in 6 months or a year or 5 years, they were like, hey, look, whatever you're doing is working, we like this. And so it's directly related to that kind of gym culture. And every now and then we would get somebody that was, bad news or wasn't in there for the right reason. We told them they weren't welcome because we understood we couldn't let that energy in because that energy could infect everybody else, or it could just lead to a bad situation where, things happen. But otherwise, UFC and MMA and training were a big part of me becoming the person that I am. And I was so grateful for the opportunity to share what I learned with other people and to help kind of spread that discipline or that focus or that recognition that it's so important to be able to learn, and it's so important to be able to go through something that's really difficult and keep going. It's so important to be able to eat that many leg kicks and keep going. It's so important to be able to get punched in the face and still have a response. Because so many of us go through life, and whether it's literal or metaphorical, we don't get hit in the face. And when we finally do get hit in the face, we don't know what to do with ourselves. We just collapse. We feel like there's no moving forward. But when you get used to taking that shot and keeping going, when you get used to recovering when things are ugly, when you get used to keeping going when someone is trying to choke the life out of you, the lesson that gives you goes far beyond prison. It goes far beyond violence. It goes far beyond martial arts. Like, that is the lesson we need to learn in life, because life is always going to knock us down. But are we able to get up again? And martial arts is a big part of why I've been able to get up over and over again.